The applause had already started before Dr. Nadia Kaur reached her assigned seat, and the Ivrithi delegate 3 rows ahead made sure she heard the correction. "Human observer section is on the upper balcony," the delegate said without turning. His chiton clicked in the dry, self-satisfied way that meant he believed he was being helpful. "This tier is reserved for credentialed panelists." Nadia looked at the embossed placard on the armrest. It read her name in Galactic Standard, spelled correctly down to the accent mark. She sat down anyway. The Ivrithi delegate's antennae twitched. He leaned toward his colleague, a broader specimen whose mandibles were edged in the formal gold lacquer of the conclave's scientific caste, and said something in undertone that Nadia's translator caught perfectly. "Someone in protocol mixed up the human's pass. She's supposed to be carrying refreshments or something." The broader Ivrithi clicked once, which meant agreement. "I'll flag it with the arbiter's office during the first recess. Quietly. No need to embarrass her." Nadia set her data folio on her lap, folded her hands, and watched the stage. The conclave of applied sciences met once every 32 standard cycles on Vareth Prime, and it was, by every measurable standard, the single most prestigious scientific gathering in charted space. 1,600 delegates from 91 species gathered in a tiered amphitheater carved from a single slab of pressure-treated silicate, debating breakthroughs in subatomic field manipulation, biocomputational architecture, and applied quantum resonance. The walls glowed with the pale amber light that the Ivrithi preferred, and the air tasted faintly of ozone and starch. Their environmental signature, a subtle territorial mark that reminded every visiting species whose house this was. Nadia had been invited as the sole human representative. Her field was resonance cascade modeling, the mathematics of how energy behaves when channeled through layered crystalline substrates. Her paper, submitted 8 months earlier through the Terran Bureau of Exoplanetary Sciences, had been accepted by the conclave's review board with a note she still kept folded in her breast pocket. Methodology novel. Conclusions require live demonstration. Panelist seat granted. She had not told anyone about the note. There had been no point. The Bureau's liaison, a well-meaning administrator named Goss, had assumed the invitation was ceremonial. "They do this sometimes," he'd said over a comm link from Geneva. "Courtesy seat. Means you can watch, maybe ask a question during the open session. Don't read too much into it." So she hadn't read into it. She'd packed one change of clothes, her data folio, and a resonance model she'd been refining since graduate school, and she'd taken a commercial transport to Vareth Prime in a seat between a Gruul freight auditor and a sleeping Keldari pilgrim. She'd paid for the ticket herself. The Bureau's travel budget had been allocated for the year, and resonance research wasn't a priority line item. The opening ceremony was already underway. The conclave's presiding arbiter, a towering Ivrithi named Quareth Selm, stood at the central dais with his wing casings folded in the formal position, a posture that communicated absolute institutional authority. His voice was amplified through the amphitheater's bone conduction system, resonating in the chest cavities of every attendee regardless of species. "This cycle's conclave addresses the C-Thrani threshold," Quareth said. "The barrier that has limited resonance cascade applications for 1,100 cycles. 4 panels have been convened, 4 demonstrations scheduled. The conclave expects results." He paused and his compound eyes swept the tiers. When his gaze passed over Nadia, it did not slow. The delegate beside Nadia, a Keldari woman with silver-white fur and the triple-braided sash of an institutional fellow, leaned over. "You are the human." "I am." "Interesting." The Keldari studied her with the quiet, unreadable expression her species defaulted to when processing something unexpected. "I reviewed your submission. Your notation system is irregular." "It's calculus," Nadia said. The Keldari blinked twice. which meant she had no idea what that word referred to, and turned back to the dais. The first panel was Evritha-led and ran for 90 minutes. The topic was substrate purification, a prerequisite step in resonance cascade work, and one the Evrithi had dominated for centuries. Their lead panelist, a chitin-plated researcher named Dreth Volari, presented with the smooth confidence of someone who had given this talk 400 times. His methodology was elegant and deeply refined, a sequence of thermal cycling and pressure gradients that removed impurities from crystalline substrates at the molecular level. His team had improved purification efficiency by 0.3% over the previous cycle. The amphitheater responded with the clicking ovation that was the Evrithi equivalent of thunderous applause. Volari accepted it with the modesty of someone who knew exactly how good 0.3% was when you were already operating at 99.1% purity. Nadia watched and took notes. The 0.3% improvement was real and well-earned, but it was incremental. The Evrithi purification method was elegant, ancient, and fundamentally limited by the same bottleneck it had always been limited by. It treated the substrate as a uniform medium. Nadia's model didn't. During the break between panels, she stood to stretch her legs and found her path blocked by a Gruul delegate. A heavy, slate-blue biped with a jaw like a quarry face and small, intelligent eyes. Human, the Gruul said. It was not a greeting. It was an identification, the way one might say obstacle or weather. Dr. Kaur, she said. You are on panel 4. I am. The Gruul studied the data folio under her arm. What equipment did you bring? This, she held up the folio. The Gruul's nostrils flared a slow exhalation of disbelief. Panel 4 is a live demonstration panel. The arbiter expects apparatus, field generators, substrate arrays, calibration rigs. He looked at the folio again. The Gruul contingent shipped 4 tons of equipment for our panel. The Keldari brought 3. The Evrithi didn't need to ship anything because the amphitheater is built to their specification. He paused. You brought a folder. It has everything I need. The Gruul made a sound in his throat that Nadia's translator rendered as noted but whose tonal register clearly meant this will be embarrassing for everyone involved. He stepped aside, stopped, then turned back. I have seen courtesy panelists before. The conclave invites them periodically. They present, the audience is polite, the contribution is filed. There is no shame in it. Thank you, Nadia said. I am not wishing you well. I am managing expectations. He left. She bought a cup of something warm from the corridor vendor, the Evrithi beverage that tasted like burned almonds and celery, and returned to her seat. The Evrithi delegate who had tried to redirect her to the balcony was now speaking to a different cluster of colleagues near the corridor entrance. She caught fragments through her translator. Courtesy invitation, the bureau insisted, political gesture. No equipment at all, just a handheld data reader. Apparently she studies something called calculus. I checked the Keldari archive. No translation entry. Checked Gruul technical index. Nothing. Checked our own directory. Nothing. Should have put her on the observation balcony. This is going to reflect poorly on Quarath's selection committee. He was warned. A second Evrithi in the cluster, an older female with weathered chitin and the rank insignia of a department head, shook her antennae in the gesture that meant weary agreement. I told the arbiter's office that the human submission was decorative, a novelty inclusion. He overruled me on procedural grounds, something about the review board's mandate to evaluate all species equally. She made a clicking sound that carried no formal meaning but radiated contempt. Procedural grounds. A young Evrithi at the edge of the cluster, junior enough that his chitin hadn't fully hardened at the joints, turned and looked directly at Nadia. His expression was not cruel. It was worse than that. It was pitying. Nadia finished her burned almond drink, set the cup on a disposal ledge, and walked back to her seat. The second panel was Caldari-led, and it was beautiful. Their approach to resonance modeling was intuitive and aesthetic, built on harmonic relationships between crystal geometries. The lead presenter, the silver-furred woman who had spoken to Nadia earlier, demonstrated a cascading resonance pattern that lit the amphitheater's display wall in rippling blue-white waves. The harmonic inputs were precisely tuned, the substrate selection was immaculate, and the cascade blossomed across the crystal like a time-lapse of frost spreading across a window. The audience watched in genuine admiration. But the cascade collapsed at the 0.7-second mark. It always collapsed at the 0.7-second mark. The Sithrani threshold was a wall, and every species that had approached it for 11 centuries had hit the same wall at the same point. The cascade would blossom, sustain, flicker, and then the crystal's internal structure would destabilize, and the pattern would shatter, and the researchers would write papers about why the wall existed, and the next cycle they would come back and hit the wall again, 0.02 seconds later if they were lucky. The Caldari presenter accepted the polite clicking ovation with the composure of someone who had expected exactly this result. Progress was progress. A hair's breadth was still forward. She had been hitting this wall for 4 decades, and her patience had a quality that Nadia recognized, not resignation, but the deep, settled endurance of a researcher who believed the answer existed even if she never found it herself. During the second break, the corridor conversations intensified. Nadia didn't seek them out, but the amphitheater's acoustics carried ambient sound with an efficiency that the Ivrithi architects had designed for their own benefit, and that served Nadia's translator perfectly well. Heard the Humans panel is last, closing slot, which means the audience will be tired and the comparison to 3 established programs will be. Almost feel sorry for her, she seems earnest. Earnest is not a qualification. I could be earnest about atmospheric chemistry. It wouldn't make me a chemist. The arbiter should have screened this. Allowing an unequipped panelist onto a demonstration panel is a structural failure of the review process. A gruel voice, deeper than the others. I asked her what equipment she brought. She held up a data folder and said it has everything she needs. I have seen that expression on my youngest daughter's face when she claims her drawings are architectural blueprints. Nadia used the second recess to visit the washroom, eat a ration bar she'd brought from Earth, and review her model one last time. The ration bar was peanut butter. She'd packed 3. Nobody at the conclave sold anything she could metabolize without advanced preparation, and she hadn't wanted to bother the event coordinators with a special dietary request for a courtesy panelist. The third panel was gruel-led, and it was blunt, methodical, and impressive in its own rigid way. The gruel did not pursue elegance. They pursued force. Their resonance approach used brute energy injection, massive field generators pumping raw power into crystalline substrates until the cascade either sustained or the substrate shattered. Their success metric was how many substrates they could sacrifice before finding one that held. The lead gruel researcher, a dense-shouldered specialist named Revik Tor, ran the demonstration with the quiet efficiency of a demolition engineer. His team set up a substrate array on the demonstration floor, 4 tons of field generators, containment barriers, and calibration equipment, and powered it up. The amphitheater's ambient lighting dimmed as the generators drew power. The air tasted of static. The cascade ignited. Blue-white fire spread across the substrate surface. The containment field hummed. Tor's assistants monitored readouts with the focused intensity of people standing next to something that could fragment at any moment. 0.5 seconds, 0.7, the Caldari barrier. 0.71 seconds, the substrate cracked along a fracture line and sent a spray of crystal shards across the containment field. The generators wound down. The lighting returned. The gruel delegation took their seats without visible reaction. 0.71 seconds was a new record for their methodology. By their internal standards, this was a triumph. Tor had pushed past the Keldari mark by 1/100th of a second using nothing but raw power and substrate sacrifice. It was engineering at its most honest, no beauty, no finesse, just the relentless application of energy against a boundary. Nadia noted the fracture line. It had propagated from the substrate's inner lattice outward, the standard failure mode. Every team that attacked the C-Thrani threshold, regardless of species or method, hit the same failure. The inner lattice destabilized before the outer layers could compensate. 1,100 cycles of research, and the fundamental problem had never changed. What had changed? 6 years ago in a poorly funded laboratory at the University of Edinburgh, was that Nadia had stopped trying to prevent the destabilization. During the post-panel recess, the Evrithi delegate who had first redirected Nadia made his move. She was standing in the corridor, reviewing a line of notation on her folio, when he approached with the older female department head at his shoulder. His expression was organized into what he clearly believed was collegial concern. "Dr. Kaur," he said, "a moment." Nadia looked up. "We've consulted with the Arbiter's Protocol Office," the department head said. Her antennae were angled at the precise degree that Evrithi used when delivering decisions they expected to be accepted without discussion. "There appears to have been an administrative irregularity with your panel assignment. We believe the review board intended to issue you an observer credential, not a panelist seat." "The review board's letter specified panelist seat granted," Nadia said. "Yes, we've read it. We believe it was a clerical error." "It was signed by the Arbiter." The department head's antennae stiffened. "The Arbiter signs many things. He does not personally vet every credential. We are offering you an alternative, an observer seat on the main floor, rather than the upper balcony. It's quite comfortable. You would still be able to watch the proceedings and submit written comments to the review board afterward." "That's thoughtful," Nadia said. "But I have a demonstration to run." The department head looked at the data folio in Nadia's hand. She looked at Nadia's face. She looked at the folio again. "Dr. Kaur, there are 1,600 credentialed scientists in that amphitheater. Many of them have spent decades working toward the C-Thrani threshold. Panel 4 is a demonstration panel. It requires apparatus, technical staff, containment protocols. With respect, the conclave's reputation is at stake. Surely you can understand our concern." "I understand it," Nadia said. "I also have a panelist credential and a demonstration to run." The department head's mandibles clicked in the tight, rapid pattern that meant frustration held below the threshold of formal complaint. She turned to the younger delegate. He shrugged, the Evrithi version, which involved a slight lowering of the wing casings. "We tried," the department head said, "and they left." Nadia watched them go. She closed the folio, tucked it under her arm, and thought briefly about the university common room in Edinburgh, where she had first sketched the dual sublattice diagram on the back of a departmental memo, because the printer had run out of blank paper. She thought about the 3 colleagues who had reviewed her work over those 6 years. Dr. Linden before he retired, Dr. Ose, who taught fluid dynamics and had learned resonance math to help her proof check, and Dr. Marchetti, who didn't understand the math at all but had once driven across the city at midnight to bring Nadia a replacement heating element for her lab when the old one failed in February. She thought about all of that for about 4 seconds. Then she walked to the washroom, because the Evrithi environmental controls genuinely were murder on human sinuses, and there was a limit to how much ambient ozone one woman could tolerate without a tissue. The recess before panel 4 was 30 minutes. Nadia used the first 10 to visit the washroom again. The Evrithi environmental controls were hard on human sinuses. The next 5 to eat her second peanut butter bar, and the final 15 to sit quietly in her seat reviewing her model. The amphitheater filled. She could feel the energy in the room shift. Panels 1 through 3 had been anticipated, established programs, known quantities, the kind of incremental progress that kept the conclave's machinery turning. Panel 4 was the unknown, the slot the conclave reserved for outsider submissions, dark horse entries, and the occasional embarrassment that served as a reminder of why the major species led for a reason. The Ivrithi delegate who had originally directed Nadia to the balcony was now seated with a datapad in his lap, and the expression of someone who had prepared a sympathetic but not too sympathetic response for the inevitable awkward silence that would follow the human's presentation. He had the look of a man composing his polite face in advance. Quorith Selm returned to the dais. His compound eyes found Nadia's section, and his antennae flattened in what she had learned to read as cautious neutrality. He was prepared for this to go poorly. He was also prepared to be surprised. The arbiter had not held his position for 40 cycles by making assumptions. Panel 4, Quorith announced. A single presenter, Dr. Nadia Kaur, Terran Bureau of Exoplanetary Sciences. Topic: Resonance Cascade Sustainability through Antiphase Lattice Modeling. The amphitheater went quiet, not the respectful quiet of anticipation, the quiet of a room that was already composing its polite response to a failure. Nadia stood, picked up her data folio, and walked down the tiered steps to the demonstration floor. She was aware of every eye in the room. She was aware of the Ivrithi delegate's prepared sympathetic face. She was aware of the Gruul contingent's folded arms. She was aware of the young Ivrithi's pitying expression from the day before, now replaced with something closer to curiosity. The demonstration floor was a circular platform, 10 meters across, inlaid with the conclave's resonance grid, a permanent installation that any panelist could use. The Gruul's equipment had been cleared, but the grid itself was live, humming faintly beneath her feet. She opened her folio and connected it to the amphitheater's display system. Her model appeared on the wall, a lattice diagram that looked, to every eye in the room, like a child's geometry exercise. Simple, clean, 2 interlocking shapes, almost insultingly basic compared to the dense, multi-layered schematics the other panels had projected. A murmur passed through the Ivrithi section, not hostile, worse, indulgent, the sound of seniors wading through a junior's presentation out of courtesy. The Thrani threshold, Nadia said, and her voice carried through the bone conduction system with the flat, clear tone of someone who was not performing, exists because every model in the conclave's 1100-cycle archive treats the crystal lattice as a single unified structure. She advanced her display. The lattice split into 2 overlapping diagrams, the same crystal viewed as 2 interlocking sublattices, offset by a fraction of an angstrom. It isn't one structure, it's 2. They're phase-locked at rest, but under cascade conditions, they oscillate against each other. The destabilization isn't a failure of the material or the method. It's the 2 sublattices falling out of phase with each other. The room was still quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. It had stopped being polite and started being attentive. Several Keldari delegates in the middle tiers had leaned forward. The silver-furred institutional fellow who had spoken to Nadia earlier was gripping the edge of her armrest with both clawed hands. Every approach I've seen here today tries to hold the lattice together, Nadia continued. The Ivrithi purify the substrate to reduce internal stress. The Keldari tune the harmonic input to minimize oscillation amplitude. The Gruul pump enough energy to overpower the instability. All 3 methods treat the destabilization as the enemy. All 3 hit the threshold because the destabilization isn't the problem. She paused. The folio projected a new diagram. The dual sublattices now animated, oscillating in opposite directions, the cascade flickering between them like a flame caught between 2 drafts. My model doesn't fight the destabilization, it uses it. She touched a control on the folio. the animation shifted. The two sublattices were now oscillating in a deliberate, controlled counter-rhythm, antiphase, and the cascade between them, instead of collapsing, was being sustained by the very motion that had always killed it. The energy that had shattered every substrate for 11 centuries was now the engine that kept the cascade alive. The amphitheater was completely silent, not the polite silence of before. The silence of 1,600 scientists watching something they hadn't expected to understand, and understanding it. Quorthseln's antennae were fully erect, the posture his species reserved for moments of genuine intellectual alarm. "This is the theoretical model," Nadia said. "The review board requested a live demonstration." She looked at the arbiter. "May I use the conclave's resonance grid?" Quorth studied her for a long moment. Then he clicked once, the formal affirmative. Nadia knelt on the demonstration floor and opened her folio flat on the grid surface. The folio's interface linked to the grid's field generators. She didn't need her own equipment because the conclave's grid was the finest resonance platform ever built. It was one of the reasons she'd accepted the invitation. Her model didn't require brute force or exotic materials. It required precision timing and a grid sensitive enough to run two antiphase inputs simultaneously. She entered the cascade parameters. The grid hummed. A crystalline substrate, standard conclave issue, identical to the ones the gruel had shattered, rose from a recessed compartment in the floor. The Ivrithi delegate who had told her she belonged on the balcony was no longer composing his sympathetic face. His antennae had gone still, which was the Ivrithi expression for a mind that was computing very fast and didn't want to be interrupted. Nadia initiated the cascade. The substrate lit. The familiar blue-white ripple of resonance energy spread across its surface. The same pattern every team had achieved today. The same pattern 11 centuries of researchers had watched blossom and die. The cascade reached 0.5 seconds, 060.7, the point where the Keldari harmonic had collapsed, the point where the gruel brute force had cracked the substrate. The cascade kept going. 0.8 seconds. A Keldari delegate in the 7th tier stood up. He didn't seem to be aware he'd done it. 0.9. 1 full second. A sound moved through the amphitheater, not an ovation, not a murmur, something involuntary. The sound of a room full of experts watching a number exceed a boundary they had internalized as permanent. 1.2 seconds. 1.5. The substrate was vibrating now, but it wasn't fracturing. The dual-phase model was working. The two sublattices were oscillating against each other in controlled opposition, and the cascade was riding the interference pattern like a surfer on a standing wave. The energy output was climbing. The amphitheater's display wall showed a curve that had never been plotted before, a resonance cascade that was not decaying. 2 seconds. The young Ivrithi with the unhardened chitin had risen from his seat. His antennae were pressed flat against his skull, not pity now, but something that looked, from a distance, very much like awe. 3 seconds. Dreth Volari, the Ivrithi substrate specialist who had opened the conclave with his 0.3% efficiency improvement, had removed his formal wing casings. In Ivrithi body language, this was the equivalent of a human loosening their tie because the room had suddenly gotten very warm. His eyes, all 4 of them, were locked on the display wall's cascade curve. 4 seconds. The gruel researcher, Revik Tor, was standing at the edge of the gruel section with his arms folded and his jaw set. His nostrils were flaring in a slow, rhythmic pattern that his species only produced under conditions of extreme cognitive recalibration. He had spent his career breaking substrates. The substrate on the floor was not breaking. 5 seconds. Quorthseln stepped forward to the edge of the dais. "Dr. Kor," he said, and his voice carried across the amphitheater with a new quality, not authority now, but genuine inquiry. "What is your projected maximum duration?" Nadia glanced at the folio's readout. The cascade was stable. The antiphase rhythm had settled into equilibrium, and the energy feedback loop was self-reinforcing. The math was holding. The math had always held. It had held in her Edinburgh lab. It had held in her kitchen on the nights when the lab heating failed. It had held in every simulation she'd run over 6 years of work. At this input level, the model is self-sustaining, she said. There's no theoretical maximum. The silence that followed was the loudest thing the amphitheater had ever contained. 6 seconds, 7, 8, 9, 10. At the 10-second mark, the cascade was no longer just sustaining. It was strengthening. The initial vibrations in the substrate had damped as the antiphase rhythm found its deepest equilibrium, and the crystal was now glowing a steady, deep blue, not the flickering blue-white of an unstable cascade, but the constant, warm blue of sustained resonance. Something no one in the room had ever seen. Something 1,100 cycles of accumulated research had never produced. The Keldari institutional fellow in Nadia's row began clicking her claws against her armrest. It was not the formal conclave ovation. It was an older gesture, the Keldari acknowledgement of a debt. She had spent 40 years studying harmonic approaches to a problem whose solution had turned out to require a different kind of harmony entirely. At 12 seconds, the older Ivrithi female, the department head who had recommended against Nadia's panelist seat, stood up from her section. She did not click. She did not speak. She stood and watched, and her antennae moved in the slow, measured pattern that her species produced when a long-held certainty was being disassembled piece by piece. At 15 seconds, Nadia shut down the cascade. She did it cleanly, reverse phasing the antiphase inputs so the cascade wound down instead of collapsing. The substrate dimmed, cooled, and sat on the grid surface without a single fracture line. Intact, reusable. A first in 11 centuries of conclave demonstrations. The amphitheater remained silent for 3 full heartbeats after the grid went dark. Then the clicking started, not from one section, not from the Ivrithi or the Keldari or the Gruul, from everywhere. Every species in the room translating admiration through whatever mechanism their bodies provided, clicks, stamps, harmonic hums, the low rumble the Gruul produced from their chest plates. The sound built until the silicate walls of the amphitheater resonated with it, and Nadia stood on the demonstration floor with her data folio under her arm, and the expression of someone who had been fairly sure this would work, but was quietly pleased to be right. Quoreth Selm crossed the demonstration floor. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried gait of an arbiter who wanted the room to see exactly what was happening. He stopped in front of Nadia and extended his forelimbs in the formal Ivrithi gesture of intellectual acknowledgement, a gesture that, according to Nadia's cultural briefing, was reserved for contributions that altered the direction of a field. It had been performed 11 times in the conclave's recorded history. "Dr. Kaur," he said, "I must ask for the record. Your submission listed your institutional affiliation as the Terran Bureau of Exoplanetary Sciences, but the Bureau's Division of Resonance Studies has 4 researchers and a budget that would not fund a Keldari postgraduate stipend." 3 researchers, Nadia corrected. Dr. Linden retired in March. Quoreth's antennae tilted. 3 researchers, and this model, the dual sublattice, the antiphase approach, was developed where precisely? My office, and my kitchen when the office lost heating. The clicking in the amphitheater stuttered and shifted into something uneven, the sound of 1,400 scientists re-evaluating several assumptions at once. Quoreth turned to the amphitheater. The conclave's records will note that the C-Thrani threshold was sustained, and the cascade model that sustained it was developed by a team of 3 on a planet that achieved first contact 41 standard cycles ago. He paused, and Nadia could tell he was choosing his next words with the precision of a man who understood that they would be archived. "The conclave will also note," he said, that Dr. Kaur's seat assignment was disputed by 6 delegates prior to this panel. I have received 4 formal requests to have her moved to the observation balcony and 2 informal suggestions that she be reassigned to catering support. The amphitheater went very quiet. Those requests have been filed, Kaur said, under institutional self-correction examples. They will be available in the conclave archive for future reference. The Ivrithi delegate who had told Nadia she belonged on the upper balcony was now studying his own knees with the intense focus of someone who had just discovered something deeply interesting about the upholstery. Nadia returned to her seat. The Keldari fellow beside her didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, "Calculus." "Yes. I would like to understand this word. It's a mathematical framework, invented about 400 years ago by our reckoning. 400 years, the Keldari processed this, and the dual sublattice model built on it. The framework lets you describe continuous change, rates, accumulation, the behavior of systems in motion. The antiphase approach is an application of differential equations to the dual lattice structure. A 400-year-old mathematical tool from a species that achieved spaceflight within living memory solved an 1100 cycle problem. Not solved, Nadia said. Reframed, the problem wasn't hard. The question was pointed in the wrong direction. The Keldari blinked twice. This time, Nadia was fairly certain it meant something different than it had that morning. The formal session resumed after a 20-minute recess that lasted 45 because no one could stop talking. During the extended break, Nadia was approached by representatives of 11 different delegations. The conversations followed a pattern she came to recognize: an opening remark about the demonstration, a careful question about the antiphase model, and then a longer, less careful question about whether she would be willing to collaborate. The Gruel researcher, Revik Tor, was the most direct. He walked up, looked at her folio and said, "I destroyed 147 substrates this cycle, perfecting a method you just made obsolete. 147. Do you know what that cost?" "I have an estimate," Nadia said. "It's in my comparative analysis appendix." His nostrils flared. "How many substrates did your model require in development?" 12, though 4 of those were because I made an input error during a late night. The heating had gone out and my hands were cold. Tor stared at her. "You lost 4 substrates because your laboratory was cold." "It was also my kitchen. I was making soup at the time." Something happened to Tor's expression that Nadia's translator had no cultural framework for, because the Gruel were not a species that experienced comedic disbelief. But his jaw unclenched, his nostrils stopped flaring, and he made a sound that was, unmistakably, the Gruel equivalent of a laugh. It sounded like a boulder clearing its throat. "I would like to send 2 of my team to your facility to study this," he said. "We don't have a facility exactly. We have a lab. It's also our break room." Tor looked at her for a long time. "I have a facility," he said, "on Gruel Prime. 17 resonance grids, full substrate foundry, 94 technical staff." He folded his arms. "It is available to you." Dreth Volari, the Ivrithi substrate specialist, approached next. His formal wing casings were back in place, but his manner had shifted from the polished confidence of his own panel presentation to something more careful, the posture of a senior researcher who had just realized that the terrain beneath his feet was not what he'd mapped. "Your model requires a substrate with intact dual sublattice structure," he said. "The purification method my team uses inadvertently eliminates the secondary lattice in approximately 60% of samples. We've been treating that as quality improvement for 11 centuries." "I noticed," Nadia said. "You noticed?" Volari's antennae clicked once. "When?" "When I read your team's published purification standards, about 4 years ago." "You identified this problem 4 years ago, and did not contact us. I submitted a comment through the conclave's open review channel. It was returned with a note that said, "The human submission does not reflect current understanding of substrate crystallography." I still have the rejection letter. Volari's mandibles went still. 4 of his compound eyes closed simultaneously, which Nadia's cultural guide identified as the Ivrithi expression of acute institutional shame. "Your 0.3% efficiency gain this cycle," Nadia said, keeping her voice neutral, "may have come from samples where the secondary lattice survived your purification process by accident. Your best results are likely the ones you failed to purify correctly." Volari processed this. "You are suggesting that our definition of correctly has been oriented in the wrong direction for 1100 cycles." "I'm suggesting it's worth checking. I will need to review 1100 cycles of purification records. I'd start with the anomalous results, the ones your team flagged as contaminated or irregular. Those might be your best samples." Volari looked at her. "You have been here for 1 day. I've been working on this for 6 years. You've been working on it for longer. We just had different maps." He clicked once, the personal click, not the formal ovation, the sound an Ivrithi made when a piece of information landed in a place that rearranged other pieces around it. He turned and walked back to his delegation. Through the crowd, Nadia could see him already speaking rapidly to his team, his antennae moving in the quick, agitated pattern of someone who had just realized that the filing system was upside down. The formal session reconvened. Quoreth Seln announced that Panel 4's results would be designated a threshold event, the conclave's term for a breakthrough that required the existing research framework to be rebuilt around it. It was the first threshold event designation in 90 cycles. The announcement triggered a secondary protocol that Nadia had not anticipated. The threshold event designation automatically elevated the contributing researcher to conclave fellow status, a permanent position on the conclave's review directorate, with voting rights on future panel selections, funding allocations, and research priorities. The last species to receive fellow status through a threshold event had been the Keldari, 900 cycles ago. Quoreth read the elevation notice in the formal register. Nadia listened to it with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression that a human observer would have described as quietly pleased, and an Ivrithi observer would have described as incomprehensible. The conclave's closing ceremony was scheduled for the following morning, but the real work happened that evening. Nadia spent 4 hours in a borrowed conference room on the amphitheater's lower level, walking through her model with representatives from 9 delegations. She used the amphitheater's display system and her data folio, and she explained calculus to species that had achieved interstellar travel before humanity had invented the printing press. The conference room had been booked for 2 hours. After the first 2 hours, the facility coordinator, a mid-rank Ivrithi administrator, came to inform them that the room was needed for a delegation dinner. The 9 delegations informed the coordinator that the dinner could relocate. The coordinator looked at the room, looked at the 14 researchers crowded around a single data folio, looked at the display wall covered in mathematical notation that no galactic standard dictionary could parse, and quietly rescheduled the dinner. The first hour was the hardest. Calculus was not merely unfamiliar to the attending species, it was categorically absent from their mathematical traditions. The Keldari mathematical system was built on pattern recognition and harmonic relationships. The Ivrithi system was built on spatial geometry extended into higher dimensions. The Gruul system was built on brute computational enumeration, counting everything exhaustively until patterns emerged from volume. All 3 systems were powerful, sophisticated, and old. None of them had developed the concept of a limit. Nadia started with limits. She drew a curve on the display wall and asked the room how they would describe its slope at a single point. The Keldari offered a harmonic approximation. The Ivrithi offered a geometric tangent construction. The Gruel offered to measure the curve at 200 points and average the results. Nadia drew a secant line, moved one endpoint closer to the other, and asked them to imagine what happened as the distance approached zero. The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of a conference session. The quiet of 9 species watching a conceptual door open that they had not known was there. Approaches, the silver-furred Keldari fellow repeated, not reaches, approaches. That's the distinction, Nadia said. The limit is the value the function approaches without necessarily arriving. Everything else follows from there. The Gruel researcher Tor leaned back in his chair, an enormous piece of furniture that the facility coordinator had sourced from the amphitheater's heavy species section, and folded his arms. Your species invented this to describe what? Trajectories of thrown objects. Among other things, cannonballs originally, then planetary orbits. Then heat transfer, fluid dynamics, electrical circuits, population growth. She paused. The framework scales. Once you can describe continuous change, you can describe almost anything that moves. And no other species has this, Tor said. It was not a question, he had checked. Not independently, no. Different mathematical traditions have different blind spots. Yours has this one. Ours has others. We can't do what the Keldari do with harmonic pattern recognition. Not natively. Tor processed this. So what you are saying, he said, is that the reason no one has broken the Cthrani threshold in 1100 cycles is not that the problem was too hard. It is that everyone had the same blind spot. Not the same blind spot, Nadia said, the same perspective. You were all standing in the same place, mathematically speaking. I was standing somewhere else. The second hour was faster. By the third, the Ivrithi contingent, 4 researchers from Volari's purification team, had begun sketching derivative approximations in their own notation, translating the concept through their spatial geometry framework. It was imperfect and ungainly, but it worked. They could see it. They could feel the shape of it. By the 4th hour, the Keldari fellow was sitting alone at the far end of the table with Nadia's folio in her lap, reading the integration chapters that Nadia had queued up for the young Ivrithi postgraduate. Her claws were clicking against the armrest again, not the dead acknowledgement click from the amphitheater, but a softer, rhythmic pattern that Nadia's cultural guide identified as deep concentration. She was learning. The department head, the older Ivrithi female who had tried to have Nadia reassigned to observer status, arrived at the conference room door at the start of the 3rd hour. She stood in the doorway for 6 minutes without speaking, watching the display wall, watching Nadia explain integration to a Gruel metallurgist, watching her own junior researchers translate derivative notation into Ivrithi spatial frameworks. Then she walked in, took a seat at the back, and did not leave. She did not speak. She did not ask questions. She watched, and her antennae moved in the slow, continuous pattern that Nadia had learned to associate with an Ivrithi mind that was rebuilding something from the ground up. The explanations were patient. The math was universal. The framework translated not easily, not without friction, but it translated. Derivatives and integrals had not been discovered by any of the 91 species present at the conclave. Not because they lacked the intelligence. Every species in the room had cognitive architectures that exceeded human capacity in one dimension or another. The Ivrithi could process spatial relationships in 8 dimensions. The Keldari had an intuitive grasp of wave mechanics that bordered on biological sense perception. The Gruel could hold computational chains of a length that would make a human mathematician weep. But calculus, the mathematics of continuous change, of rates and accumulations of the behavior of things in motion, had been developed on Earth by people who needed to describe cannonball trajectories, planetary orbits, and the area under curves. It was a product of a specific kind of curiosity applied to a specific set of problems, and it had never occurred independently anywhere else in charted space. Not because it was superior, because it was orthogonal. The closing ceremony the next morning was a formal affair, conducted in the Ivrithi tradition, a processional review of each panel's contributions, followed by the arbiter's summary and the designation of the cycle's priority research directives. Nadia sat in her assigned seat. No one suggested she move. Quoreth Selm worked through the panels in order. He was thorough, fair, and precise. He acknowledged Volari's purification work. He honored the Keldari harmonic research. He noted the Gruel's new duration record. He gave each delegation its due with the measured respect of a presiding officer who understood that incremental work was the foundation on which breakthroughs were built. Then he reached Panel 4. Dr. Kaur's contribution requires a different category of acknowledgement, he said. The conclave has not issued a threshold event designation since cycle 3847. The resonance cascade breakthrough will be designated under Dr. Kaur's name and institutional affiliation, as is standard. He paused, and his compound eyes swept the amphitheater one more time. I will make one additional note for the record. When Dr. Kaur's submission arrived, my review committee debated whether to extend a panelist invitation or a courtesy observation pass. The committee was divided. I cast the deciding vote in favor of the panelist's seat. He clicked his mandibles once, the personal click that Nadia now recognized. I would like it noted that this is the only correct decision I have made this cycle that I was not fully confident in at the time. The amphitheater produced its ovation. The full, formal, cross-species acknowledgement that shook the silicate walls and resonated in the bones of every attendee. Nadia accepted it the way she accepted most things, with her hands folded, her posture straight, and the faintest trace of warmth in her expression. The arbiter continued with administrative announcements. The next cycle's conclave would prioritize antiphase applications across all existing resonance disciplines. Funding directives were being rewritten. The review board's submission protocols were being amended, effective immediately, to require that all outsider submissions receive full panel evaluation regardless of the submitting species' tenure in charted space. The amendment was proposed by the older Ivrithi department head who had, 36 hours earlier, tried to have Nadia reassigned to catering support. The department head stood when the amendment was read. She did not look at Nadia. She did not need to. The amendment was the statement. After the formal proceedings, the delegations dispersed into the corridor for the final reception, an Ivrithi tradition involving small plates of food that Nadia couldn't eat and a fermented beverage that smelled like wet stone. She stood near the corridor window, eating her third and final peanut butter ration bar, and watched the shuttle traffic moving against the amber sky of Vereth Prime. The Keldari fellow found her there. The silver-furred woman stood beside her at the window and said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been in the conference room. I have been thinking about something you said, that different mathematical traditions have different blind spots, that yours has blind spots too. It does. What are they? Nadia considered the question. We're poor at pattern recognition across large harmonic datasets. What the Keldari do intuitively, identifying resonance relationships in complex wave systems, takes us years of computational brute force to approximate. Your harmonic intuition is a mathematical sense we don't have. The Keldari absorbed this. So the antiphase model, it uses your strength, continuous change, rates, differential behavior, but applying it to large-scale resonance systems at galactic scale would require our strength. Yes. That is why you accepted the conclave's invitation, isn't it? Not to demonstrate superiority, to find collaborators who have what you lack. Nadia looked at her. My kitchen has a very limited data set. The Keldari blinked once. A single, slow blink that Nadia's cultural guide did not have a specific entry for, but which felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of a long professional relationship. After the reception, as the delegations filed out toward their transport bays, the young Ivrithi with the unhardened chitin approached her in the corridor. His antennae were folded flat against his skull, the Ivrithi posture of acute discomfort. "Dr. Kaur," he said, "I owe you an apology." Nadia looked at him. He was young, early career, probably a graduate assistant attached to one of the senior delegations. His formal carapace was polished but ill-fitting, the way new professional attire always was. "For what?" she said. "Yesterday, when the other delegates were discussing your assignment, I looked at you and He stopped. His mandibles worked silently. "I assumed you were out of your depth. I assumed the invitation was a political favor. I assumed you could not possibly belong here." "What changed your mind?" "You solved the Seethrani threshold with a folder and a kitchen." "A folio. The distinction does not improve my position." Nadia studied him. "What's your field?" "Substrate crystallography, first year postgraduate." "Then you're going to have an interesting career. Your entire field's purification standards are about to be rewritten. You'll be the generation that grows up with the new framework instead of having to unlearn the old one." "That's not a small thing." The young Ivrithi considered this. His antennae relaxed into their neutral position, the closest his species came to visible relief. "Dr. Kaur," he said, "would it be appropriate for me to request a copy of your foundational framework, the calculus? I'll send you the introductory texts. Start with the integration chapters. The derivative work comes easier after you've seen what accumulation means." He clicked once formally and walked away. Nadia watched him go, then picked up her data folio and walked to the transport bay. Her return shuttle was a commercial flight, the same line she'd arrived on, the same class of seat. The Bureau hadn't arranged anything special for the return trip. They still didn't know what had happened. Gauss would find out when the conclave published its proceedings, which would take approximately 6 standard days, by which time Nadia would be back in Edinburgh, reviewing the heating bill and wondering whether the lab's radiator was going to survive another winter. She settled into her seat between a Gruel mining contractor and a dozing Keldari merchant. She opened her folio and began writing her notes from the conference, starting with the corrections she'd want to make to her model based on the questions she'd fielded. The folio chimed with an incoming message. It was from Quareth Seln's office, addressed formally to Dr. Nadia Kaur, Terran Bureau of Exoplanetary Sciences. "Dear Dr. Kaur, the Conclave's Permanent Research Directorate has voted to establish a new interdisciplinary working group on antiphase resonance applications. By unanimous decision, the Directorate requests that you serve as principal investigator. Attached, please find the facility allocation, personnel secondment offers from 14 delegations, and a budget proposal that, I am told, exceeds the Terran Bureau's annual operating expenditure by a factor of 31. We look forward to your reply at your convenience. Q. Seln, Presiding Arbiter." Nadia read the message twice. She closed the folio, leaned back in her seat, and looked out the viewport at the stars sliding past in the blue-shifted smear of transit speed. The Gruel contractor beside her glanced over. "Good trip." "Productive," Nadia said. She closed her eyes and thought about the integration chapters she'd promised to send to the young Ivrithi crystallographer, and about the 1100-cycle archive of purification, records that Drethvolari was probably already tearing apart, and about the fact that somewhere in a conclave filing system, 6 formal requests to move her to the observation balcony were now preserved as institutional self-correction examples for the education of future delegates who might otherwise assume that the person carrying a data folio instead of 4 tons of equipment had nothing worth hearing. The shuttle hummed around her, The stars moved. Nadia Kaur, who had come to the most prestigious scientific gathering in charted space with the equivalent of a notebook and a bag lunch, slept the whole way home.